Hello, just in case you missed our meeting on Friday, February 10th, here's a quick video of what we discussed. So we began by, of course, looking at our map of the engaged teaching model, and you can see we've made our way all the way around to talking about assessing and evaluating teaching. And there's a link on the slide that has all of our videos and all of our slides from the engaged teaching model on our website, and you can check that out. And then our agenda follows our typical pattern of talking about knowing what, knowing why, and knowing how about assessing and teaching. So we talk about what that is, why we care about assessing or evaluating our teaching, and how to go about having an active approach to that, being proactive and gathering data formatively. So we began with a quote from our authors, Barclay and Major. In general, what we mean by assessment and evaluating teaching is a systematic approach for gauging the effectiveness of our teaching. And I went right ahead and shared that I have a pet peeve with the way in which evaluation and assessment can sometimes be conflated. And they really are two different things. And particularly when we're talking about program evaluation, or in this case, course evaluation, we're looking at the differences between assessment and evaluation, assessment being specific measures and evaluation being holistic measures. So we talked about these things. I'll be talking about these things in terms of what I believe is in reality the difference between assessment and evaluation from someone who's studied evaluation. So I have to, I understand that's a bit of my own bias, but I think of assessment as being described as specific, learning oriented, and there's product assigned with it. So for example, when we want to assess student learning, we have specific things that we are measuring with a specific product. Maybe it's a quiz or a test or a presentation or a research paper, but we are assessing. Evaluation is holistic. It's looking at the value added of a course, for example, or a program or a particular learning activity towards the program or process. And so when we talk about course evaluations, end of course evaluation, we're looking at the program as a whole. Sometimes people talk about assessment evaluation in a way that's conflated. So we can also talk about assessment and evaluation as being formative or summative. So I can evaluate a course along the way, so which I can make changes, or I can evaluate a course at the end, which is often what we see as end of course evaluations. The problem with just having an end of course evaluation is it's a summative measure. It doesn't allow you to make iterative changes to the course while you're teaching it with your students. It helps you make decisions about the next time you're going to teach it. But we want to try to think about good evidence as being both formative and summative. So when we have good evidence, our authors tell us, we can typically make better teaching decisions. Without evidence, it's really just a shot in the dark. So knowing why, research on evaluation and teaching. So our end of course evaluations and student learning related. So early research and a very popular study was done by Cohen, and it was published in 1981. And that study said that students learn more from professors with high ratings. So what's being said here is that when we assess students' skills, learned skills, that when a professor receives an end of course evaluation with a high score, those students are learning more. And then when additional studies have been done, we have not been able to replicate those results. So a well-cited study Clayson, 2009, says that student evaluations were not related to student learning. And Clayson went back and looked at some of the same studies that Cohen analyzed in the 1980s. So what essentially they're saying is, if I have two teachers that are teaching the same subjects in the same schools, and one teacher has a higher end of course evaluation scores than another, Cohen would say, oh, the teacher with the higher end of course evaluations, their students are learning more. Clayson's revisiting of all of these studies are saying, well, just because one teacher scores higher in the end of course evaluation, it's not showing that those students learn more. It's about relationships. So really, what end of course evaluations tell us? They tell us about relationships and feelings of belonging. So, which is good information to have. It's important to know that teachers in your college are developing strong relationships with their students, because we know when the students feel a sense of belonging, it helps our enrollment and retention. People want to be places where they feel that they belong, and they're more likely to complete their certificate and their program when they feel like they belong. So evaluations tell us some things, but not others. So it tells us about relationships. But we looked at some other research questions that often come up in this literature, and we talked about the results. So for example, a question that often occurs in research is, does a course difficulty or workload correlate with students' ratings? So do faculty that have an easy program get better or higher scores than those that students perceive as more difficult courses? No, students aren't fools. They rate teachers based on their relationships and feelings of sense of belonging. Just because they have to work harder in one course or another, or have more homework in one course or another, doesn't mean they're going to score that teacher lower. So there isn't evidence to support that an increased difficulty means the teacher is going to score lower. A closer look at literature around the question, does expected grades show a correlation with student ratings? Maybe. So the research here is very split. So a student there's often a question on end of course evaluation that says, what grade do you expect to get in the class? And students that expect to go to a grade of A or B do typically score the professor higher than students that, about half the time, students that expect to get a C or D. But that isn't always true. Students who expect to get a C or D in the class may still score the professor higher if they have a relationship with them, and sometimes even indicate that they weren't able to do their personal best in the course, but that doesn't mean they're going to rate them poorly. So that one's a maybe. The research there is very split. Are student evaluations biased? Research here is very clear that yes, we all have biases, and these biases also occur in end of course evaluations, which again impact the effectiveness of what we can learn from them. In particular, female professors teaching in STEM fields typically receive a lower student score, and often are marked as being less knowledgeable on evaluation courses in the field. So yes, just like all of us in everyday lives, student evaluations are biased. So does that mean that student evaluations are valid and reliable? Are they? And overall, yes, statistically, they are valid and reliable, but we know that there are issues with them. We know there are areas where they're ineffective, but they are statistically valid and reliable. And I think authors do a good job of talking about this. What is clear is that we cannot depend on student ratings of instructors or instruction to be indicative of student learning. how a faculty member scores on evaluation does not tell us clearly what students have learned in that course. We need other measures. Remember, it's going to tell us about the relationship, but not necessarily about student learning. So knowing how, an active approach for assessing and evaluating. Think about how an attorney might get ready for court and what types of things they might put in their briefcase, what evidence would go in their briefcase. So you need to gather evidence from your students to get a full picture of what it is that is happening, in particular with regard to student learning. So our model, Engage Teaching Model, talks about direct evidence and indirect evidence. Direct evidence is things like examples of student work, pre and post assessments. What did you know before? What have you learned after? And I always say, don't discount reflective surveys when you're measuring students' learning growth before, instead of just a traditional pre and post. You can also ask post, because sometimes we don't know what we don't know until we've experienced it. So we can also have indirect evidence, right? So early feedback forms. What do you want me to continue doing? What do you want me to stop doing? What do you want to know more of? So we talked about lots of examples of different things that we are doing in our classes, like an index card or an exit form, or 1 or 2 open response questions on an anonymous survey. Clear as point, muddy as point, start, stop, continue. We talked about, again, that early feedback form, a midterm feedback form, asking our students for feedback in a formative way. And also reflective surveys came up again here. Have students self-report. Did you know how to do X at the beginning of the semester, and how confident do you feel doing it now? And again, what others? And then we talked about how to make sense of some of the end of course evaluation data that we get, or mid-course evaluation forms. And we felt pretty confident about numerical data, but qualitative data tells us a lot, and sometimes it's difficult to make sense of. So we went into breakout rooms and looked at 8 statements that were on a Jamboard, and then we categorized these responses from students into groups. So in each breakout room, the groups read through the statements and grouped them in ways that categorize the data for understanding. So we only had an hour together, so we just did this for a few minutes, but we had a great discussion about how we could look at this further, and how some of the responses from students could be coded or categorized in more than one way. So on one side of the screen there, you'll see one group's gathering of their data. They categorized it by environment, homework, things they'd like to do differently, things they should continue doing. And the group on the right, even though their categories are a little bit different, they had the similar ways, similar things that they found out, things that they would want to keep doing to support students, things that they could change. That also had, both of them had things about the class environment that they may or may not be able to change, but was important for them to take note of. So we talked about, what would we do with this open-ended data when we get in the future, now that we've become comfortable with practicing that. Then we came back together and we talked about more types of evidence that we can gather. We talked about how your colleagues can help you collect evidence. They can talk to your students. We talked about the TAP on our campus, where faculty members are invited to talk to students in other classes. They can observe what you do. We talked about you are the data instrument that is the closest to your class. So step back, really observe what's happening, listen to your students' discussion, record yourself, and look back at what you have, how you're conducting your class, how you carry yourself, how you ask questions with students, and think about your own measures of change that you want to gather. So don't discount yourself as a data collection instrument. And then our last slide together was, we talked about some key points that have been adapted by Brent and Fielder, who did a study about what exactly is it that we can measure? What are we measuring when we're collecting information from students, from peers, and from yourself? So we can collect from students how effective they feel the instructor is. We can collect information about the course overall. We can collect information from students about their own learning and growth. And we can collect information from them about how available they feel you were in helping them meet their needs. We can collect from our peers information about the learning goals for our course. Are they in alignment with articulation and course sequence? We can gather information from our peers about our course materials, again, alignment and support, assessments, assignments. Are we working collaboratively with our peers to support students? And again, these authors also talk about you as an instrument, to think about your pedagogy and practice based on your feedback that you receive, your personal learning goals, and student achievement and growth. What are students? What skills are they gaining in your course, and how are they applying them to their real lives, to their certificate, to their program, to their articulation to another institution? Then we ended off with our map and talked about our next meeting taking place on March 3rd. Thank you very much for tuning into this video, and I hope to see you at our next meeting.